Thanks, everyone. And I'll add my own acknowledgement of traditional owners before we begin today. So thank you so much for making time in your busy schedules to think about some of this together. I just want to start by asking who is from the kind of careers space and careers professionals, careers, fantastic student support, academic, who's teaching, who's not teaching but leading all the teaching. Excellent. Oh, that's great. Thank you. It's such a great opportunity to have a mix of people like this, because this is very much a collaborative space. And I was asked a couple of weeks ago, are you treading on career services toes? And I said, no. What we're trying to do is to leverage the expertise in our career services by working more in partnership and within curriculum. And universally, that has been very well received by our careers colleagues. So we are going to think about employability with ability capitalized very purposefully. We'll understand why in a couple of hours' time. And we're thinking about it as metacognitive. So it isn't skills. I try and avoid the word skills, jobs, and employer. And try to think much more holistically about this as a process, and a process that is very cognitive, that involves a great deal of thinking, independent thinking, and problem solving. The opportunities bit, I guess, is the catchphrase to try and get people to come along. But of course, it depends where your interest is. It might be purely in the teaching side of this, in really engaging students in this thinking. You might also be an academic who's feeling a little bit of pressure to publish. I think that happens. And of course, we are all under pressure. So if you feel that there is scholarship and educational research in this for you, then please stay in touch with it. We're going to start, though, it's a workshop, so I'm not going to talk for 2 hours. If you can grab a post-it note, if you can see one, or just a bit of paper, and write down 3 things you're good at. What would have been a much simpler question? 3 things we're not good at, absolutely. And students feel the same. This is a fabulous icebreaker for students. And a great introduction to a strength-based model and a way of thinking that's really different. They're focused very much on why they didn't get the 36%, on where the criticism was in their feedback, and what we're trying to do is to get them to think differently about their strengths and to take that feedback and carry that forward into their own development. So it's a different way of thinking, and this is something, if you have one of those classes where you've got 800 students piling into a lecture theatre, you can put that on a PowerPoint as they come in, and by the time you start the class, most of them will have done it, or at least have thought about it. So employability, what is it? To me, this is what it is: the ability to find, create, and sustain meaningful work across the career lifespan. I'll send you these PowerPoints by email, a link to them, so that you don't have to write things down. It's a very different definition to the skills one, and it puts us in the space of developing employability. I call it employability thinking, rather than the outcome, which is where our metrics are. Whilst the metrics are there at the moment, it is only a matter of time before a form of performance-based funding comes into being. And I'm certain that one of those questions will be to students, graduates, were you prepared for your careers? That means that when we prepare them for this way of being, for their futures, it needs to be explicit. They need to know that they have actually engaged in this space. And it's also a different message because it doesn't have an end point. It says that this is something we're all still engaged with. And it's a very powerful message for students to know that they don't have to have got there by the time they graduate, that this is just the beginning of it. And when I work with students, I say to them, what we want to do is to give you the ability to make those decisions and to negotiate that world whilst you're still with us, so that when you graduate, you're far more able to do it on your own. What is it not? Well, it's not necessarily employment in the traditional sense. It's definitely not a destination, because we're always involved in it. It's not necessarily a process that stops at graduation. In fact, I would think that that's very damaging if it stops. it's not necessarily a job. And I think that there's an awful lot of media and messaging within institutions to students that we kind of give the message that they're the first people to go into this really precarious labour market. And they're not. And it's really frightening for them. So it's sometimes a really useful thing to break down career. Anyone who's on our LinkedIn community will have seen the Duke of Wellington post last week. The word career in the vocational sense is less than 200 years old. It's a new construct. And actually it's a blip in history that there was this idea of a traditional, so-called traditional full-time job with a single employer. We're now reverting back to what there was before. And it's really quite empowering for students to know that other people have worked in this way, and they actually worked very well in this way. I mention exclusively in the workplace because will is another message that we receive all the time. So many universities are now saying every student will have a will experience. I couldn't think more highly of will. But it isn't the golden bullet. And managing it, as those of us involved in this space know, is really complicated. What is a quality experience and how do we measure it? With the online tool that our students are using through the employABILITY initiative, quite often there are requests to measure a will experience by doing the tool before and afterwards. My question is always, what are you measuring? Well, we know that the students will be more employable when they come out. But they might be less confident when they come out than when they went in, because they've suddenly realised that there's a reason to do their homework, there's a reason to study, or maybe the workplace looked nothing like they thought it would. And so when we measured the efficacy of these things, of course it isn't linear. So that's what I think employABILITY is not, and that in higher education we're in the business of employABILITY development, but the metrics sit at the employABILITY outcome. So 3 things you're good at. What kinds of things did you write down? Is anybody going to workshop time? Shout out something you're good at. Communication. A few communicators. Great. What else did we have? Facilitation. Great. That's a leadership skill.
Attention to detail.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. That was attention to detail was another one.
Being an empath.
Being
empathic.
Being empathic. Yes, empathy. A lot of recruiters tell us how important that is. Did anybody put GPA? When we ask students what they're doing to prepare for graduate life, they tend to say study more. It's all about the GPA, and somehow it doesn't matter how many times we tell them it's not all about the GPA, that's still where they're focused. But interesting, of course, we wouldn't have put that because we know what it's like. So 3 things you're good at, great way of breaking the ice with students and getting them to think differently. If I'm lucky enough to get a workshop time with students, I'll give them, each group, a whiteboard marker and get them to just at any time come to a whiteboard and start noting those things down. And each activity they'll think of other things or they'll share with each other, and eventually we'll have a board full of things that the students have added. We photograph that and send it to them. It's a really great way of getting them to think differently. employABILITY thinking. But why is it important now? We've mentioned a little bit about the metrics and the pressure from governments to demonstrate a successful outcome, however that's defined. But it's actually driven by people as well as the labour market. So first of all, the way that large corporations are working. So along with more and more startups, small to medium enterprises, the large corporations are working differently. If we have a graduate work for KPMG or a big corporation, Ernst & Young for instance, they're likely to have multiple reporting points. Those reporting points in a big multinational might be in 3 different countries. So essentially they're doing 3 different roles, reporting to 3 different people, and they're having to manage their time and probably their professional development in a different way than we would have done in a traditional full-time role. Workplaces are becoming virtual. I'll say now, we all work in academia, so if you relate all this to academia, it will seem very familiar. Working in a virtual workplace might mean that you are isolated from other people, or that you are working all around the clock. Don't suppose anybody else does that in this room, and the 24/7 work. But it does also mean that you have to be self-directed. It's very unusual now for somebody to sit in an office space where somebody asks them to do this on Monday and this on Tuesday morning, and on Wednesday afternoon the next project comes. These organisations are becoming distributed, and then we get these really flexible patterns of work, which are often seen as, I think the way that it's communicated to students, especially in the media, as something that's really very difficult to get their heads around. But actually it has loads of opportunities as well. Flexibility for people who are juggling different roles. And I have a background in the arts, and one of the things we're advocating is what is the line for actors? The most important thing you learn in an acting degree is, do you want fries with that? And yes, there's truth in that. I was a music graduate. I know how to, I'm not a barista, but I know how to stack a lot of plates and do the dishwasher. But why is it that people are doing that? Well, people go to those roles because they're flexible, because you can actually negotiate with McDonald's, for instance, to your shifts to fit in with your arts work. But there's less reason now for a business to need somebody to work on a Tuesday between 9 and 5. In fact, there's great opportunity now for somebody who's really creative to go in and do a project intensively that fits in with their arts-based work. So it's that kind of thinking in industry that is starting to emerge. And of course, if you're home-based, you can be very isolated. My son now is not home-based, but for 2 years he was home-based working for a multinational company in engineering, finance, and on his own. So lots of flexibility, but also the demands of how you manage your time and your professional learning and develop colleagues and networks is really difficult. So I think that's why it's important now. There are good reasons why governments are really interested in this. It isn't just the massification of higher education. And in fact, if we look at the way graduate employment and GDP work side by side, our graduates have not become less employable. Not at all. You can see the GFC here. But otherwise we follow suit. And that's ABS data, even with our very simplistic mechanism. And again, from a conversation article last year, you can see that graduate employment increases as GDP rises. These are good slides to share with people who say graduates are far less employable than they used to be. They're actually not. So I think we're doing pretty well. But the reason we get those popular media articles are this kind of metric. This is from our graduate outcomes survey. You'll have seen these types of graphs. Quite damaging, I think, and a time that we started to fire back some real figures. Here's performing arts. So I think if my parents had seen that, they'd have been asking questions. Biological sciences, other natural sciences, language and literature, communication and media. As a parent and as a potential student, you might be wondering whether they're a good idea. But actually, if we mine the data, even with the poor metrics we have, we can see a really different picture of work. And please share these with students. They're very powerful messages. If we add part-time work, we start to see a far better picture. And if we add casual work as well, now that's a better picture, isn't it? That's really showing what our graduates are doing. Now, in the UK, they've managed to overcome the privacy law barrier to link student data with taxation figures. That means that they will be able to look at what graduates are doing through tax data, anonymized, of course. We're now looking at the same thing, and the discussions at the government level at the moment are the depth to which we'll be able to look. Imagine that, if we could see, instead of what was your main job last week, what kinds of things our graduates are doing. We don't even know at this point whether it was a graduate level position. So an example given to me last year by an ICT lecturer was an ICT graduate working for Woolworths. are they stacking baked beans, working on the checkout, or are they actually working in the IT department of Woolworths, looking at kind of the economics of the operation or business analytics? We don't know. So this is the kind of things graduates need to be ready for. And this is all cognitive. It isn't skills-based. Those of you who work with academics who say it's not my job, these are the conversations to have. It isn't about developing skills. When academics say they should go somewhere else to develop that, it's actually about cognition. What we want is independent thinkers who are able to make decisions, who are able to understand where they might fit within a complex environment and understand their values. We know that when graduates or students go for placement interviews or graduates go for recruitment interviews, they might be asked to give evidence, to articulate their abilities. Often they haven't spent time working that out. So tell me about your leadership. Not sure. But they may have been coaching soccer. They may have been doing work with the guild. They may have maybe a parent. Great leadership role. Another one is tell us about your ability to work with other people. They may have been in a rock band together for 4 years and kept it together. They may have been organising gigs. All these things that they do outside university, and not just the volunteer work, because we know there's an equity barrier for students who are working full-time, studying full-time, have caring roles. They don't have the time to commit to volunteer roles that more privileged students do. So getting them to think more holistically about that and to create that employability thinking, strength-based, oh yeah, I can do that, is really powerful stuff. And we do it from first year, and it really switches on their brains to that way of thinking. So essentially we need them to see things differently, and for me this is 22 years of work, and I used to do this with my students maybe 15 years ago, paper-based, getting them to just see things differently. And what I discovered, and it is backed up by the literature, is that taking students away from text-based responses is really powerful. So we're going to do that as well. On the table, there is a sheet called Looking Back to the Future. Grab one of those and turn it over to the blank side and draw a square. Okay. All right, while I'm doing that, what I want you to do in that square is to draw a successful graduate. Thank you. Doesn't it make you think? So I give students 4 minutes for this. 4 minutes seems to be just about right. And when students do it, I ask them to write a few words about what you've drawn, because then that takes the thinking to a different level again. Okay. Now, if anybody wants to share those with me, please take a snap of it with your phone at some point and flick them through. I've got probably 5,500 student ones now, and nowhere near that many academic ones, and I'd love them. So what do we do with it? Well, theoretically, we use things like rich text analysis to look at the drawings and to understand what it is that students are telling us, and it's fascinating. Sophie has done a bit of analysis on this with students at Monash and Colin, and it really does tell us very different things. But we know from an ed psych perspective that the reason these drawings are used in areas such as social work are because it can create a creative and risk-free environment. But we don't often use drawings with adults. So a 6-year-old would have no problem or wouldn't even think about drawing, whereas we think, oh, but I'm not good at drawing. So did anybody think that? Drawing? I can't draw. That would be my first thought as well. And for me, it would be a stick figure if it was a person, yeah. Whereas other people can draw. But the fact that it takes us out of our normal space means that students don't give us the expected answer. They start to conceptualize what a graduate is to them. And I noticed at this table, what happened was that you started to look at each other's, And Rachel said to Deb, oh, that's a good idea. I couldn't think how to visualise that aspect. And that's what students do. If we had 3 hours, which we don't, but in my idea of heaven, when I get 3 hours with students, I love this. We use butcher's paper or A3. And what we would say is, OK, now create a combined picture of a graduate in your discipline. And they get together and they start to really think about it and compare and to bust some of the myths. And they do that without us. And they come up with different questions. So let's just see what kinds of things you included. Lots of people. I can see lots of stick figures and people. What else did you put into the picture of a successful graduate?
I did an infograph because I just don't do stick figures, but education, a symbol around education, not just higher education, but
a symbol around.
Opens up a lot of opportunities.
Okay, so education opening opportunities,
Symbol around education.
and you did it as an infograph.
Yeah, I didn't do the stick figure. I tried. You did your little scroll too well. I thought it was too much competition.
Too much competition because of the graduate scroll over here. Brilliant. What else did we have?
I did a set of scales and thinking about a successful business grad having some work-life balance.
Brilliant. So Sophie did a set of scales and it was about a business graduate having work-life balance. I'm very good. I wish I need those. I'm sure other people feel the same. Yeah, so you used a metaphor. You used a set of scales. Any other metaphors in the room? Yes.
Yeah, I must have subliminally looked at the waves there because I've got somebody jumping across waves.
Oh, someone.
Buoyancy, and they've got their hand up, so they're being a bit visionary and opportunistic.
Oh, I love that. So this is someone jumping across the waves, buoyancy, visionary, being opportunistic. That's fantastic. I love the waves. One more metaphor.
I had roads forking and going different ways and a big mountain chain that you could cross.
Great. So Adrian had roads forking different ways and a mountain range that you could cross. And that's a very common metaphor, is that road. I think that's because in the original Latin, there are two bits to the word career. One is the road and one's the carriage. We seem to have kept the road bit and lost the carriage. And one of the things I love to do with students is to say, think about the carriage because you can take that anywhere. It's not the road that's already built, but that career path, that idea is still very much there, isn't it? Did anybody draw trees? A few trees? Yes, Athena.
I just drew a lot of choices, and one of them was a palm tree and just taking a year off and asking yourself, who am I, what am I, all that kind of stuff.
So the idea of a palm tree and taking a year off to think, who am I? I'd like to do that. I think that's a great example of the need to kind of really think about who we are and that identity development. It isn't just about developing a career. We hear all these things about career development. It's actually life development. It's about how do I fit career into me rather than the other way around. Students are much more open to that messaging than they are to career development. Does anyone know the Stanford initiative, Designing My Life? Yeah? You're engaged with that. It's fantastic. So this was invented by two academics who thought it would be really cool to have an elective about future. What does the future look like? And it's now the single most popular elective at Stanford. Now they do some really wonderful things in that, and it's essentially employability thinking. But I think what really got the attention to start with was the fact that they didn't call it Career Development 101. In fact, they didn't call it career development at all. It's called Designing Your Life. Students are interested in that. So I have a version of it called Create Your Future. And we use Create Your Future all over the place on the visuals and on the messaging and on the language to engage students. They're interested in creating their futures. So you find that many more students engage in it. And if you're requiring them to engage, they engage with a bit more or a bit less reticence than if we called it career development. So we're getting them to see it differently. Here's a couple of the combined diagrams. These are very wordy ones. Normally they're more visual, but these come from speech final year speech therapy students, speech pathology, the ideal speechy grad. And over here as well, you can see smart, professional, friendly, incomes on there. We say that's all right. Doesn't all have that. Students often are a bit kind of shy about the extrinsic motivations to take a major. So don't be. No, it's important. And here's one that has the road. Is it like yours, Adrian? So, you know, new opportunities. It does. It has the mountains, and the mountains were resilience, making meaning, balance. We've got the balance here. Persona, interesting, and client outcomes, and the fact that they have P plates on to start with. And this one made an acrostic puzzle. So students will do all kinds of things if we give them the opportunity to create a group image. And what we did with that workshop, because like when I worked with Colin and Sophie over at Monash, is the groups then presented their image to everyone else and told them what they were thinking. Amazing. And I know the whole messaging of employability thinking is that it's not about doing more, it's about doing different. But if you do have space in a unit to do something, even if it's 4 minutes of a drawing, it really pays off. So this isn't a quick thing. It took, well, for me, 22 years. And I think probably longer, you know how things kind of fester in your subconscious. As a music graduate thinking, now what? Carnegie Hall didn't call the day I graduated. The local orchestra didn't suddenly have a position for a viola player that was vacant right then, full time. I have to create my own work. How do I do that? What does that look like? What's a startup? Where do you fund these things? Why would somebody hire me and not the next person? There's plenty of music graduates around. So I had to work it out for myself, and I think that's probably what drove me into education and into this area. So after all this time and lots of collaboration and working with loads of people, we tried to break it down, and this is the model. Now, I'm not going to go into the theory this morning. Conversations anytime you like about the theory, but essentially it's a socio-cognitive model, which I might even have taken out for this morning. It's socio-cognitive theory. We have just done our third lot of exploratory factor analysis. All but 2 factors on this measure load onto a single construct. And the 2 that don't, it's fascinating, students' understanding of the relevance of their program to their futures, and the second one, which is, it's an aspect of career commitment, which is about whether they have a plan B. What happens if Carnegie Hall doesn't call? Now, that doesn't surprise me, and I'm sure it doesn't surprise you, but it tells us that this measure really is standing up now as something that is a predictor of employability, and that enables students to think about their employability thinking at different times. So we're using 6 literacies to get away from the skills debate. And we're going to look at 2 engagements, the academics and the students. We'll start with us. And when I say academic, I mean all of us working in academia. So we have 6 literacies, and we have a big job to do, and we have these challenges: lack of time, lack of resources, and we're not trained careers professionals, apart from the careers professionals in the room, and that's why we need that expertise. There is a great phobia that email me if you want me to, because I'll have to spell it out phonetically. If you want this, it's called anapholsterophobia, and it's a fear of overcrowding the curriculum. It's a real thing. And I think to an extent, we all suffer from this. And certainly when we work with academic staff who've not been engaged in this space, because these workshops are always, you know, you're preaching to the choir, then often it's, I just don't have time. I get it, but I don't have time to put it into my curriculum. So we really have to think about how to overcome that barrier of time by enabling things to be done slightly differently. Lack of resources, an associated issue, and the expertise, especially for academics who are career academics and maybe haven't ever worked as an industrial chemist or as an engineer or even as a teacher, and are thinking, I'm not qualified. And it's a real worry. These are all really legitimate concerns for academic staff. And so our work over the last 2 years with this particular grant, which was an OLT Senior National Fellowship, was how do we get this thinking in front of students and how do we work with faculty to overcome those barriers? And that's really what employability thinking is about. Now, there will be an email in your inbox that has the Educator site and the student site. We used to have, previous iterations of this, just one site for educators. And that was before I got to know so many careers professionals. And they tell me that they spend about 80% of their time with the 10% of students who need them least. Lots of nods around the room. That is because of the final year panic. What does my resume need to look like? The placement panic. How do I get a placement? And also the fact that the students who are really agentic, the ones who are already in this space, and someone mentioned before the workshop regional students in their experience, pretty much in this space, and often that's the case, those students make demands of time because they want to get things done. They're developing faster, in fact, than we can develop them. So we realised that there was a need both for just-in-time learning for when the panic hits and for those proactive learners to be able to get the resources they need. And that doesn't mean that they're not going to go to the institutional resources, but you'll see that what we've done is just a little bit different. We only launched this site last July, and it was a soft launch because we were still building it. And in October, it was fascinating to watch, using Google Analytics, all the students who were coming onto that site and grabbing cover letters and resumes and interviews and elevator pitches and, you know, all those practical things. Whereas at the beginning of semester, they're doing more, what's my persona and what am I doing here type of things. So at the end of this fellowship, we have a 10-step process, and your email, the link has embedded links to each of these things. But essentially, this is what we're looking at. And you'll see that it's a cyclical process. So it's all free because it's on Creative Commons. It will never be commercialized. My ideal, this is my passion. We all have a passion for being here. My passion is that every student engages in explicit employability thinking once a unit. So we're not asking for kind of whole-scale changes to classes. We're looking at one touch point. That touch point could relate to a reflective task, a team assignment, an industry visit, a guest speaker, something that the students are doing anyway, and we flip it outwards so that it has absolute relevance to their futures. This is doable. I really believe this is doable. There's a community of practice on LinkedIn, and each week we have a different topic. Doesn't inundate your inbox, but it's growing by 5 people a day, which doesn't sound a lot, but it's actually growing. It's great. So that LinkedIn community is a place where people can ask questions. I've got this coming up, not sure how to do it. The students complete a self-assessment, and that's the big thing for me, is we push them through a tool. That tool forces them to think about their futures for 15 minutes. And it probably is 15 minutes they've never done before. There's some good research about career development that says we spend more time planning our holidays than our careers. If you've all have seen popular versions of that. It's true. Planning a holiday takes ages, and we don't often take that space out with the palm tree, even a day, just to think about what are we doing here and what do we want. So the idea of the tool is that students can, all students can engage in it, and we'll go through a bit of it later on, and that they get something out of it that is really valuable and a good resource. The next thing is we identify those employability touch points, and we're going to trial that in a few minutes. Our students create their profiles, and if it's a whole cohort, I create an aggregate map that we can use with them. We use the resources wherever it's appropriate, and then we pass on the process. So we embed it in our own unit so that we know that even if we go to somewhere else, it's now embedded. And then we say, who else has the students? Who has the students next semester? Is there a core unit? Or are they split in 3? Or where do the majority of them go? And we try and pass it on to the next person. And then, of course, if you want to, you can engage with the data. So the data from that profile tool are amazing. Students don't have to do the open questions. They actually asked for open questions when we trialled this. And they write and write and write. They tell us all kinds of things. They really want a voice. And they tell us what they're concerned about, and they tell us what their aspirations are in a really different way. So we're now looking at some cohorts where they're engaging with their profile tool in first year, they're doing it again in second year, they're doing it again in third year, and we'll start to be able to scaffold their learning in a really different way. So that's what it will look like on your email. You can play with that as you wish. So now down to the nitty-gritty. How do we do it? We're going to play with some unit outlines, which I've downloaded from the internet from all over the place. And I'll give you 3 examples just to get us going. Here's an example from Curtin. It's first year planning students, planning and architecture. Looks like any standard unit outline with the graduate attributes. We're all big on graduate attributes. What do we do? Well, what we did was we found that they have a reflective task here. Has no percent. So are they going to do it? Well, that's what I said. Well, yeah, Colin said, yes, they will. Yes, for what reason?
I don't think anybody would do it at all.
No.
Besides, it's in week 2.
Yes, exactly. In week 2.
The educator isn't valuing it. I mean, you know, as a task.
And actually, when I talked to the educator of this unit, she said to me, oh, but we do value it very much. And this goes back to this conversation about changing things. One university said it takes 2 years to change assessment through the formal process. Now, it may not take you 2 years, but it's not going to be done in 5 minutes either. So what they've done is they've valued reflection, and hopefully that reflection will gain some percent at some point. But at this point in time, at least the students are doing it. She knows they're doing it because they have to do it in class, in groups. So she's made it happen. So we thought, well, if they're doing a reflection, then that is an employability touch point. So we put in, this is an example of an educator guide. This is an educator guide on how to assess reflective writing. And it was developed with Carol Evans at the University of Southampton in the UK. And she's the feedback and assessment guru, like David Bowd, the two of them, fantastic. There's one on employability thinking using digital literacy. I thought you'd like that one. Joe Caldwell-Nielsen from Deakin. We've incorporated digital literacy right the way through the literacies. It's ubiquitous, that's why it isn't its own thing, but it's very explicit in what the students see. So we did that, and then we put up a student resource, and we just uploaded that into their learning management system. We have Blackboard. I hear you have Canvas here, and it's fabulous. I'm a bit jealous. We have Blackboard, but we put that up and we explained to students the ability to reflect critically is also often tested in interviews by recruiting firms and employers, so pay it some attention. So we say, why bother? And we say, because. So we don't assume that they will get the relevance of doing this. And in that resource, there's 6 different strategies. We can say to students, use strategy number 3, or we can say, choose one of them and tell us why you chose that one. Entirely up to you and knowing what the students are able to do. We used strategy 3 with this group, Smith's reflection on action. So there's one example. It was very easy. We did it in the week before semester started, and this semester students are using a template for their reflective task, and that template is prompting them not just to reflect on something they've done, but to carry that forward to say, what is the relevance of that for my learning and for my development as a graduate? Just those 2 things. And by adding that, we're starting to get them to think employability thinking. This one, really different one, pharmacy students, it was another Curtin one. In this unit, there's all kinds of things. There's a portfolio, which would be a whole other day of talking about portfolios, and role plays. We could use any of those things for employability thinking. We chose role plays, and we brought in some scenarios from international students who were talking about their experiences of being in a work placement. And those international students had struggled with all kinds of things, like in one of the scenarios, the student was working with an older lady, and he'd asked for information and the lady had said no, so he'd said okay, because that's respectful. You don't argue with an older person. And then the supervisor was very cross about that. So what we did was we shared these scenarios with the students and said, come up with a different scenario when you do your role play. So the students have a mock pharmacy in their classroom, and they normally you'd come in, you'd have somebody asking for codeine and have to explain why you can't buy it over the counter anymore. And the students came up with their own versions of this, that they might be a grumpy customer, they might be a customer who had very little English language, and they came up with these scenarios. And then they reflected on why that might be useful learning and how they would deal with that in the future. That's employability thinking. So it took no longer than it took previously. We didn't even change an assessment item, but we've embedded it. And here's the third one from my initial discipline, music. And the only thing in this one was a site visit. Now, we often have a careers panel, a guest speaker, a site visit, a careers fair, some kind of contact with industry. They're brilliant touch points. But how prepared are students for those? So with this group, we thought, well, it's the only time they're going to meet somebody, and they're going to meet with the CEO of a major music venue. So we said, what do you really want to know from that person? And the performers, of course, well, I would have said, why would you hire me? You know, how do I get hired? So we asked them that, and what we did to make that happen was we uploaded a student resource called the Careers Panel. I've had this one for years, but it didn't look like this. So all these questions that other students came up with. One is, if you had a TARDIS, when would you go and why? Fantastic. And they create a ticket. So for these students, before they go to their site visit, and it works really well for panels and guest speakers, they have to create 3 questions of their own. It does 2 things. First of all, it makes sure that they've read the list of other questions, because they don't want to write one that's already there. And secondly, it makes them think about what they really want to know. And then they can do it on their phone as a text. And that's their ticket into the event. So we're getting them to think in advance and to come up with some questions. It's employability thinking. Very simple. This unit actually already had also had a group project reports, and we realised they must at some point be working in teams. So we can use a team, how to create a high-achieving team, which is actually a self-assessment. It's about thinking about my strengths, my weaknesses, the things I like to do, the things I don't like to do, and also about how the team might function together. And in cases where that's worked really well, where we've had students, when they create their team, which generally happens in class time, create a team, get together, I'll explain what the task is, that we incorporate in that the question, who's going to do what and why? So they start to think, oh, well, who's good at managing time? Okay, well, I can do that. Who's good at the detail? At the back, yes, attention to detail. So we'd probably put you onto that. Somebody's great at public speaking. What happens is that then, employability thinking wise, we would say to them, which of these are important in the profession that you're aiming for? And taking engineering, which is one of my favourites to work with, we would have things like project management, and groups that think that project management wouldn't be important in engineering because it's about the technical aspects of the practice. Of course, anyone who works with engineers knows that engineering is 99% project management. It's about communication, interpersonal skills, managing people, managing projects. And so they can start to bust again some of those myths around what practice actually looks like. And somebody who thinks that managing a project is not a strength yet can identify it as an area for development. So it's just getting them to think beyond that task. All right, we're going to go on to student engagement. So I'm going to get you working again in a minute. I'll just go through what I think are the parameters for us and why, and then we're going to have some unit outlines to play with. From an educational psych perspective, we know that we don't want students to do anything that lasts more than 20 minutes, not a single task. 15's even better. So somehow we had to find a way of engaging students initially without it taking more than 20 minutes. It had to be online. I have a very strong equity agenda around this space, and so making it online is, I know that isn't perfect, but it's a downside better than having it offline and in classes in city campuses. So we made it online. It has to be formative. Does anybody use psychometrics with their students? Psychometric tests? Yeah. I used to as well, and they still have a place. One of the difficulties of psychometric tests, particularly those that cost money, is that students do them once. And having done them once, they label themselves accordingly. So I'm an I-type personality, or I'm not creative, we often get. And what I wanted was a way for students to understand that there's a fluidity in this space, that they might do it again in 3 weeks' time and come up with a completely different result. We had some students recently who did the tool, the online tool, and just before a workshop, and when they were talking about it in class, I just had an hour with them, but they said, oh, we were on placement and we were stressed out. We were on a 2-week placement. It was the last week of the placement. It was like reports and trying to get used to it and all the rest of the things we had to do. And we had assignments due. And they worked out that if they did the tool that day, instead of when they'd been in that stress state, they would have come up with a different type of profile. Interesting. And they recognised that. There has to be a net gain. Students must be about the most over-surveyed population on the planet. Every week we ask them to respond to some kind of survey. How often do they actually even get the results of that? I don't think we're very good at sharing the results of those surveys. So students don't understand the relevance. It's just something they have to do. Some of us even withhold grades until they've done various surveys. So it had to have a net gain for students. It has to be something that gives them more than they put in. That was really important. If it's agentic, then it might help to alleviate some of the 80% of the time with 10% of the students who need them least type of scenario for us as teachers as well. And I wanted it to be resource rich for educators and students, but always in plain language. So you'll see plain English in everything, and that's because it doesn't mean we haven't thought about the theory, it's just that that's not the language we need in this space. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take some unit outlines, which have come from all over the place. It's basically some universities have their unit outlines behind a firewall, others they're just open to the universe. So these are ones that are open to the universe. And we're going to think about the make it count aspect. All the student resources we have, and we've done 70 now, have a make it count that take an activity they engaged with and say, now make it count. How does this activity relate to your future? How can you collect evidence of this? How can you articulate it? How can you change your thinking? What will you do next? So we're going to be looking in these unit outlines for that kind of opportunity. I call them, employability touch points. And what we're looking for is some place within a unit where we can engage students in their future thinking. Ideally, they'll all have completed a profile, because then I can share with you a whole cohort of results so that you can get the graphs of what the students are thinking and share that with them. They love it. Much better than a textbook. And we're looking now for a touch point within each of these units. I've got 2 spares, so who's got a really busy table? I think that one is. Would you like an extra one on here? Anyone else who feels they can't reach? Another one on here. Okay. Great places to look to start with are the week-by-week calendar, if there is one, and the assessment tasks. Start with those and see what you can find. And as you read these, imagine that you're reading them, hopefully they're not in your discipline, you're reading them as a student would see it for the first time. And I'll come round and help. Thanks, everyone. So these were just randomly accessed unit outlines. Thank you. And it was great to see all the conversation around it. Can we just share with the rest of the room some of the things you found within these unit outlines, because you'll have found different things and it will be helpful to all of us to have those different ideas about employability touch points. So do we just say, anybody stand up and tell us, or do you want to do a round robin? At the back, yes, Fiona.
We had a design technology subject, and it wasn't very clear what the assessments were, although we felt that there was opportunity for feedback in every type of activity, like the students had to present work in some form, and it's not clear what that is. But the fact that it's got feedback in it, we thought, well, and we started talking about how students receive feedback and what they do with it, and then we related it to the idea that, well, in the workplace, of course, you're always constantly getting feedback. So we thought if you could do some sort of build in something there about giving and receiving feedback and how you respond to feedback, that might be the link there.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So this simply says exercise 1, exercise 2, portfolio. It's not very descriptive. As somebody over there said, it wouldn't make me get up out of bed in the morning. So partly I think the language we have, if we're just calling it exercise 1, what is it that motivates students to come to it? You know, class 1. Can we say learn how to, engage with, develop your, would be much better weekly titles for our unit outlines. But that's great. Carol Evans at Southampton and I had 2 weeks intensive work on this, and we developed an educator guide on feedback and a student resource on feedback, and a feedback quiz for students, which asks whether you're a feedback seeker or a feedback avoider. And it's really great. So they've just been published a couple of weeks ago, and they're terrific tools, both for when there's feedback in an assessment context, but also when there's a team-based assignment or a team-based project, and they need to be giving each other feedback in a formative way as they go through. It's really how to do that. So they're really useful ones. That's great. I love that example. Thank you. I'm going to come and stand next to the person who's talking so that David still gets the sound. So who would like to go next? Right, I'll look across the room. Yeah, great. This is good. I'm getting my 10,000 steps.
So we had a unit that had a 75% exam and then just an assignment at 25%, so not very much information. And I don't know, I'll speak on behalf of us all and they can correct me. We initially kind of discounted the exam as an opportunity, as a touch point, but on reflection think that perhaps it's an opportunity. We just don't know how, but it could have a reflective component in the exam. But they also talked about doing quite a few group sort of work in classes, and also there's an industry, or actually it doesn't say industry, does it? No. It was just a guest lecturer, and we thought perhaps that's an industry link and we could leverage off that as well.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. 3 really good examples. Even if one of those happened, just one of them in every unit, we'd change the culture of higher education. So the guest lecturer, interesting, somebody at another table was saying as a careers professional, when you do that guest lecture, you know, the way students are prepared for it makes all the difference. And whether it's couched as next week we're doing career development and students don't bother coming. No, how do we make that relevant? So again, use the create your future.
Yeah, I think Christian, you said how to start thinking about that, or it might have been Tim, I can't remember, said we need to start thinking about that in week 1, and building up to the lecture. In
Yeah,
year
that's
6.
it's very good feedback, and I think also that when we have careers professionals, I hadn't thought about this, but your guest speaker could be from within the institution, and those 3 questions still have absolute merit. Colin, you had a comment.
Just a related point, I think, not necessarily directly. Looking at, we had a unit outline that had assignment 1, what's it called, exercise 1, exercise 2, and portfolio, but there's much more in the unit outline about what students are not supposed to do than what they are supposed to do. And perhaps I shouldn't be talking quite so loudly. I'm going to go back to my own workplace and just make sure that ours isn't quite as off-putting as that, because it was horrifying to me.
Somebody else at another table had a unit where there was far more in the plagiarism space than in the assessment box.
Yeah.
So same thing.
Yeah.
It's not very motivating for students, is it? And I think the idea of having that kind of class 1, exercise 1, I mean, it doesn't tell them what they're going to get out of it. So yeah, I think I'm looking at unit outlines differently now as well. So maybe that's something that is transformative, we would say, wouldn't we? That's great. What things did you decide you might do with your unit?
Changing the unit to the other one, because there was actually there was very little there to go. And in fact, we had an interesting discussion about why, for organisational reasons, why you often don't put much detail into unit outlines, because there can be constraints on how often you can change things. So the less detail you have, the less fuss you have with.
And the more detail would go into something that perhaps isn't accessible to everyone online. You know?
And the more detail you go into, it then isn't accessible to your students who are studying remotely, is Jane's comment. This is such a good point, that unit outlines we often leave deliberately vague because we're not sure. It takes so long to get things changed through the system. And we want to make sure that nobody's going to accuse us of not delivering point 7, which couldn't be delivered because they are studying only online. Wayne, a comment?
The problem with unit outlines is that they serve 2 masters. There's the accreditation, the formal aspect, and there's the communication with students. What I've found most successful is to actually have 2, like the official unit outline, and then a separate, much more condensed document that was focused just on the student needs, in terms of this is what you're doing, this is why this unit should be interesting to you, this is the assessment, these are the key touch dates, and then just leave it as that so that you avoid that issue.
Thanks, Wayne. So this is the idea of having 2 outlines, one that's focused, that's student-centred, and one that is serving the accreditation requirements and so on. Does anybody else do that? Sort of. I think
the other way around. Have a short, what we call generic unit outline that has all the stuff that's needed for accreditation and has short assignments.
So the short one that's the official one.
Or something, and then we have an extended unit outline.
And a longer one for students. Yeah. And I suspect that in our own practice, a lot of us do that. We do that even in the first lecture by sharing with students what the unit is actually about. But it does go to the point, somebody did some research when they asked students how many students actually read the unit outline, and it was dismal. But you can see why. You know, they're not terribly engaging. So maybe we can have a bit of a shift to unit outlines as well. That would be fun. So you had, in the design tech course that was so vague, you couldn't really make anything out of it. That means there are great opportunities to do things in it. But my challenge here is, if you made something fabulous out of it, how would you embed it? Because if there's nothing in the outline, so I think those vague ones are where we actually need to put more detail into the outline. Sorry.
One of the 2 learning outcomes there did talk about critical thinking.
Right.
And critical thinking is a major employment. You could work with that.
You could definitely work with critical thinking. Yeah, that would be a great one. Thank you. So even in a vague one, you found something. What did you find over here?
Ours was very similar too.
Yeah, very similar. I think one of the things in our unit outline was kind of a repetitive thing, that for 3 times it was test and sample materials, test and sample materials, test and sample materials, and you could use that as some sort of reflective way of improving, or some sort of reflecting on your own practice and how the first test was different to the last one and what you learnt and so forth. So that could possibly be some sort of touchstone there.
Yeah.
Someone else has starred folio, and they're not. Anyone want to speak to the folio one? Rachel?
I started induction.
Oh,
Can you
Safety induction in week 1. That's another touch point.
I was thinking about getting them to reflect on safety inductions in the workplace and why we do it in a relationship for safety. I mean, if you're thinking about I'm thinking about an example of a wheel subject that I work with, where we get them to, this is what you're going to be assessed on by the employer, and get them what areas do you want to improve on, add to, those sorts of things.
Yes, so that's a really good point. Thank you. So that the safety induction that these students do in week 1 could be related to different workplaces. So why might this be an issue in a workplace? And then I'm getting them to think about the relevance of that to their own practice, not just as graduates, but also as students. So if it was a safety induction in a lab, for instance, that's on campus, that they might be thinking about where the synergies are with a lab that isn't on campus, something that's in industry, and really making those connections. As I said, the one factor that was the weakest in our analysis so far, we got 2,500 tool completions from students, and it's outstanding in its lack of alignment with everything else, is students understanding the relevance of their learning. We've got to be explicit about it. So one case about 10 years ago, I was working with a colleague in engineering, and we were in the 4th of 4 foundation units. So engineers, it was a 2-year program. They do 6 months on each foundation unit. So they'd done fluids and so on, and they were on motion. So it was a whole semester course on motion, and I'd been invited to come in and work with the students on some employability thinking, and we were having a great time. But on one of the workshops, I did an icebreaker because I didn't know the students. So my icebreaker to them was, why did you choose this class? Now I knew it was compulsory. So they said, we have to be here, which is a great, good icebreaker because they all giggled. And then I said, well, what will you get out of it? And someone yelled out credit points, which is actually quite common. That's great, yeah, good, credit points. What else? So we might learn stuff, right? What kind of stuff might you learn? So then they start to kind of point out some things, and I said, great. So that's where the relevance of this unit is. And one girl, hand right up, and she said, it's not relevant to me. It's really interesting. So I said, thank you for being brave. Yeah. Would you be comfortable in, sharing, expanding on that a bit? And she said, yeah. She said, sure. She said, we're about to choose our specialty engineering discipline. She said, I've come in to be a civil engineer. I am going to be a civil engineer. This is a unit on motion. It's totally applicable to all those guys over there, because there were guys over there who are interested in F1 and they're doing mechanical engineering. It has no relevance to me. I'm designing buildings. Now, engineers in the room will be thinking, well, hang on a minute, buildings move. They have moving parts. But no one had taken the time to say to this student, this is the relevance of the Fluids Foundation unit for all engineering practice. And it was a real eye-opener for us, and we thanked this girl profusely afterwards for being the one to point that out, that even in foundations units, I would say probably especially in foundations units, we have to be explicit about what the relevance is of each piece of learning. These unit outlines are not doing that. So it would be great in my mind if the unit outline did it, and if we did it to the students. In that first lecture, it goes to what Adrian was saying earlier about those great foundation cohorts where they come in and they're really not sure why they're having to do this thing.
I think, Dawn, the piece about folio is a wonderful opportunity to help students to understand it's not about what's in the folio, it's how you articulate your thinking around how you developed your ideas, how you thought critically, how you solved problems.
So this is a comment on the folio. There's a folio assessment here. Does anyone incorporate portfolios? Yeah, not many, some. So a portfolio, it can be Pebble-Pad, of course, and one of the commercial programs. It can also be a Dropbox folder where students put stuff. And in first year, if we can get them to put stuff into a Dropbox folder, it's great because then they know where things are. So they're not on 100 thumb drives and computers when they actually need that bit of evidence. So that's the first thing. We just want students to collect things. But of course, in critical thinking terms, we want them to be able to say why they chose to include something, or even better, what they left out and why. So what did you leave out of this portfolio? What did you leave out of this job application? What did you leave out of? Because it's getting them to think about why they selected it. And to do that, they have to think about its relevance. So that's the kind of critical thinking bit. So if you don't have a folio, don't panic. You know, there's an institutional platform, another thing to learn. Dropbox folder. Tell them, put things in a Dropbox folder. That then comes to, and this table was talking about it in a more advanced level unit, why do we still have assignments that are assignments? I don't get that. Why don't we have assignments that are, and it was either Amanda or Nicola used the term artifacts. They should be creating artifacts. Now, two things. First of all, if the assignment becomes an artifact that they can then showcase to a potential client, work placement host, employer, I use the E word, recruiter, then it has use. But secondly, and really important for me, is that if they are creating an artifact, when we give them feedback, or they hear from other students about what they've done, they might even read the feedback, act on it, create a better artifact, and then upload that. Now, that's employability thinking. So I think I'd love to see, particularly in the final year units, the number of assignments as assignments that are only ever read by the students and the examiner reduced and turned into artifacts that are evidence. Because then they have to understand what evidence they're building.
I'm just sort of extrapolating a bit from that.
Yes.
Does that mean, do you think, that the traditional essay is an endangered species?
Is the essay dead?
Yeah, or at least endangered.
Well,
I mean,
yeah.
is that going to be a sort of credible artefact to present to an employer?
So how about if students write an essay and then they have to extrapolate from that essay a one-page summary of the pertinent points, a crib sheet if you like. So they've just done a lab on a chemical process. They've had to write it up as a lab report, or they've written an essay on a facet of literature, and then they have to create the one-pager on that. Now that is a really important skill, something that we all need to use all the time. It's a bit like creating the abstract. So where is the core of it and what does it mean? Now that's just a critical thinking technique. So I'd say that the essay can be used in that way. I'd like every essay to have a front page that tells the essay in a page. But secondly, it goes back to that point about assessment. Why, when we plan assessment, what is it we want to know? Why are we assessing this thing? And you know, assessment can take time to move, up to 2 years, I'm told. So that might not be something that we do for next week's class. But when we have a program review, it's a great opportunity to look at those assessment items and say, what is it we want to know from this piece of assessment? And then it might raise the question about whether an essay is the best structure. The essay might be the best structure, and it might be a really important skill. I mean, report writing is a very important skill in most professions. So I would certainly not say that students should never learn to write essays. But it's how do they choose what to include where and what to leave out. Yeah. Wayne.
Dawn, when I was teaching at Melbourne Polytechnic, I actually had my students use WordPress blogs, and I actually structured it so that everything that I looked at was published on the WordPress blogs.
Right.
And the end result was I'm still bumping into students who got jobs off of their blogs because they just put it on their resumes, they'd send the links to people, and were getting work out of it. And even if it was a piece of work that I didn't want them to make public, what I would have them do is write a reflective piece, which they could make public. So that then at least they were leveraging it in some way.
So they're developing artefacts.
Yes.
Yeah. Did everyone hear what Wayne did? Yeah, with the blog. Can you write that up for me as an expert guide, please? Because I don't have a guide on that. So a blog's a great example of that front page of an essay, isn't it? It's a different way of synthesising. We tried this with final year writing students a few years ago. We had a blog actually whilst they were in placement, Rachel Robertson, who's in professional writing programme. And it was really hard to get them to engage. We incorporated a portfolio as well. In the first iteration, they loved the how to create a portfolio workshop, and none of them created one. Then the next semester, we did the workshop and we followed up with examples and all kinds of things. And I went in about 4 times during the semester and did kind of careers or employability thinking, and they developed artifacts. They were final semester, so they were in this space. None of them created a portfolio. So in the third semester, and we wrote this up, it's a very funny paper, I think, because it's the kind of story of failure. In the third semester, we forced them to create a portfolio because they had to upload their resume into it. That's all we said, but it meant they had to engage. They were off and running. And alongside that, we ran a blog. And in the blog, we mandated that they had to blog and respond to a blog 6 times or 3 times each. And once they were in that space, then they started to do what Wayne said. What we didn't do was get them to then take that and create artifacts, and that's a brilliant idea. Yeah, that's great. So they're not doing anything more, they're just thinking differently. Yeah, thanks, Wayne, that's a great example. Who have we not heard from? These are such good ideas. I'm glad David's videoing. We can keep them all.
We lucked out because we got a postgraduate strategic entrepreneurship unit.
Postgrad strategic entrepreneurship.
So there was so much employability.
Well, that's good to know, isn't it?
But we decided to focus on the final assessment, which was an individual report on what they'd done, which included interviews with the people in the thing, and it included some market research as to whether the product would work or not, and so on. And we thought, in doing that, to focus prior to the assessment on them investigating what it means to write for an audience, what these reports need to look like, how to write executive summaries, and things like that.
So you're facing the report outwards rather than inwards as an assessment.
That's right. And then possibly including some sort of reflective thing at the end that goes with the report on that.
That's great. So like that table there, the reflection at the end and using one of the templates, getting that kind of make it count box where students take it forward to their future learning. That's fantastic.
Yeah, I think so. We had a peer, we felt that there was a peer learning opportunity there where they, once you've identified what the audience is and you've done an individual report, there's a chance on various learning platforms to nominate a peer reviewer who can help you not to rewrite it, but so you give them that instruction, but to match the production with the audience, the specified. So that the other student peer reviews them, gives them a chance to, which is normal. What we do in our own professional life.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, but very few, most students handing in an individual piece of work almost always hand in their first draft.
Yeah.
And yet we know the key in a professional job is that it's probably your third.
And that you might give and receive feedback on it. Wayne, can I ask, with your blog, the students who engaged in the blog, did they start to give peer review without you asking them to do that? That's what ours did as well. They actually coached each other through the semester. So,
and the other thing that I got them to do, and they actually started doing it themselves, and then I leveraged it in class, was treating the material as something which they could continue to modify and work on afterwards, and that was often something that they did with their peers in the class.
Yes.
So somebody would say, you know what, I really like the basis of this, but you should add this, and then they do a bit of co-writing together and add it to somebody's blog, and that worked really nicely.
It's really powerful, isn't it? Yeah, so you could do that and the formal, it depends on the unit. But you can see there are so many opportunities here to embed that. We're just talking one thing in a unit. So with this audience, you're already in this space, you could add 20 things. But for you, for most academics, one thing is enough change. So if you've got one thing into every unit, we're getting them started. I want to, oh sorry, yes, Athena.
That, a lot of it is text-based, and there's a lot more pressure now on students to video and come across and the perception there. So is there room to sort of move towards a less text-based artefact creation?
Definitely.
Yeah.
So somebody was saying in Adelaide earlier this week about students interviewing industry. They do this matter of course. They say find 2 people to interview, but not collecting that in any way. So he said, well, why don't you get them to show them how to use their smartphones to create a 3-minute video? So that kind of thing where they're using digital technology more. We're working really hard on putting digital technology hints and ideas throughout the site and the report. I'm not the expert in that space, so if you have other ideas, please let me know, email me. These resources are not all Dawn resources, they've come from all over the place.
I mean, the elevator pitch.
Yes.
That really lends itself to some, you can record.
The elevator pitch is a good one, isn't it? We, with our pre-service teachers, we use the elevator pitch, and like most of us, they found it hard. The blowing your own trumpet is, it's awkward, isn't it? And one of our lecturers, Rachel Sheffield, used an avatar, free avatar program. So we gave the students a link to that, and instead of speaking, videoing themselves giving their elevator pitch, they used the avatar, and they found that really good. It was like a mask. So they all did the avatars, and then when they were ready, they did that. And we had them do at the same time me as a teacher. So they had just the picture of themselves, and then they put them up and the peers commented on them. So, we got the, oh, you look really great, and the, that blouse is a bit see-through. I'm not sure that you should wear that to school. And from those of us who've been teachers looking at them, say, you're going to last 10 minutes in those heels. Buy yourself some sketches quickly. So they got all this feedback about themselves. But the avatar was really useful. Yeah, and that was free. Yeah. These are fantastic ideas. Thank you, everyone. So the step 1 for students is really getting into that starter kit. It's called the Student Starter Kit. It was named that by a student, so we thought that was a great name. And they create their profile, which comes to them as a PDF with embedded links, so that they have all that information for when they need it. In the profile report, which you can do the tool yourself, and in the email it has the link, and you just write test where it says student number, and you can go straight through. It says how do I use it, it explains how the make it count box works, and all the way through it, it refers them to sources of help. So whether it's talking to the lecturer and tutor or the counsellor or going to their careers service, and really positioning those people as partners. We also point them to a couple of free portfolio sites in case they're thinking they want one. Here's an example, and this is a personal one. And you can, the vision's not very good because the light's bright, but it's a spider graph. And the reason for that is not to have a score. If you have a score, then the idea is that you just improve the score. And it isn't. Employability thinking changes all the time. So when you're working with students, say to them, if I had a new job next week, I would be more or less confident on any of those literacies, and that's the way life is. So this is your employability thinking, your confidence at this point in time, and it will change. So we say use it as a prompt for analysis and action rather than a scorecard. So they never see a score. Of course, there's an algorithm that sits behind it, which is a score, but they don't see that. And here's a cohort-wide summary. Nicoletta Maynard and myself, we worked with the first year engineering students at Curtin last year in the beta version of this tool. And this is the first year, typical first year profile. Basic literacy includes the discipline, skills, knowledge and practice. These students have just arrived at university. They were in about week 3 of their degree, and they're saying, we don't know it yet. So we've lots to learn about being an engineer. And we can see similarly that their career commitment, their thinking about themselves as engineers is really strong. I'm going to be an engineer. Now we know also that there is high attrition, relatively high attrition from engineering programs and from engineering practice in the first 3 to 5 years, a bit like teaching. So when we engage our students in it, this year, as second years, we'll be able to look at how their thinking shifted, both as a meta view and also in detail, and think, are there things that are indicators to us about why their thinking has shifted? Do they need some extra scaffolding? Is there something else we need to do? So I think both as a kind of teaching tool that's fairly instantaneous and also for trying to predict where our students need more support, this is going to be really interesting. We've only 2,500 so far, but when we've got 100,000, we'll be able to look at whether, and I suspect they are from what we have, the boys are more confident as first years than the girls. So they actually appear, if we did this in gender, they appear as far more competent. We might be able to look at first in family or particular equity groups and to see whether there are needs, specific needs, whether their thinking is different. And if it is different, what do we do about that? Where are the opportunities? The open questions, I've been experimenting with these because students don't have to write anything, but they write masses of things. And I thought I'd share some of the weighted word clouds I've created. So I've been doing these, if a whole cohort does them, Colin and Sophie has a cohort, all done them, I create weighted word clouds. I do that because I can do it really fast. And if I was sharing the raw aggregated data, I'd need to make sure that if there's one student from Vietnam and Vietnam's in a response, it's been taken out. So it's a bit more cleaning to do. But this one is a fascinating question. It says, besides your studies, what are you doing to make yourself more employable? And the students say work, volunteering, volunteer, opportunities, working, experience, volunteering, pathology, etc. That's quite unusual. The ones that I've seen from other cohorts generally are really focused on study, skills. That's what they look at. And this cohort, this was a speech pathology cohort actually, and they were in final year, they've just been on placement and they're focused on industry. So it just gives us a bit of a picture. But what's really useful with these is when the students have completed the tool, is we share these with them. I share them as PowerPoint slides, and so we put them up and we say, this is what you're doing, talk to us, what are you thinking? And they come up with both the ideas they have, sometimes really innovative, and also the things that they're really worried about. And for how long do you intend to work? Now this is partly a research question because when I was working with pre-service teachers a long time ago, I thought it would be really cool to ask them how long they intended to work as teachers and where, because the attrition rate's so high. So I couldn't do that with my own students, so I borrowed other people's students and they answered these questions. And we found out that there was a percentage who were doing a teaching degree for reasons other than becoming a teacher, and they had no intention of becoming teachers. So that made us think, well, actually the attrition rates are not accurate. And also, what are we doing to prepare them for those other settings? So if they're becoming a teacher to travel or they're becoming a teacher to work in church and community settings, what are we doing to prepare them for that? So how long do you intend to work has students thinking about that, and I know it's harder to analyse when it's qualitative, but we will be able to then look at, are they anticipating a 10-year engagement or a 5-year engagement? Or are they saying until retirement, which we quite often see? So the open responses for the student's point of view, they come into the text boxes within their individual report, which means when they're reflecting on a particular thing, the associated question response is there and they don't have to go back and find it. They'll lose their reports, most of them, of course, so they just go back to the student website and their student number is their unique identifier, so they can download their report. They can also create as many as they like. They don't overwrite each other. So that I'm hoping with one cohort we'll have the students look at their spider graph each semester and reflect on how their thinking has changed. So they can do that. All the boxes are embedded so that, again, we're just trying to make it really easy for students to engage. All right, I'm going to finish with this. So I'm an incoming student and I've just chosen a degree. This is chemical engineering. There you go. Oh my goodness. Yeah, isn't that great? And there were electives besides this. Yeah. So somehow I'm going to negotiate my way through. Now, the reason I'm showing this is that I think there's something that we might be able to do across programs. And it came from Leeds University, where a head of school said, we don't have an integrated program, we'd like one, not sure where to start. And so we had a map, not quite as busy as this one, but we had 4 years of the degree, and we looked at in which unit students were doing something that I would call employability thinking. So it could be something big like a placement, and it could be that there's a guest lecture. And what we did was we highlighted them, literally highlighters. It took us an hour and a half to go through the program. That head of school then took the program map to the next T&L meeting and said to everyone, this is what we're doing, what do you think? And an academic said, my unit's not on there. So it turns out that what the academic was doing was, like that very broad unit, was doing fabulous things, really good practice within the unit, but beyond the curriculum. And I think there's a lot of that good practice that works almost in spite of the curriculum. How do we capture that? If we could capture that then and embed it, then the work would be done in a lot of places. So it's about embedding and sustaining those good practices. And in this degree, that's where it exists formally, but there's probably other things happening. I hope there's other things happening in other units. When I've done a few program maps now. Second year is the dead zone. I think we must do a lot in first year to really engage students in their professional identity and so on. And by third year or fourth year, they're starting to panic, so it's more explicit. Second year, the dead zone. So what we're aiming to do with some programs is to do this mapping exercise. If you're in program review, you know it already, it's in your head, it doesn't take very long, and put create your future at the top. And that becomes a visual not just for students to see how their professional development happens, but also for staff, so that we can understand how things fit together. So that's something I'm just starting to do now, and if you have a program review, you think that might work in your program, I'd love to work with you on that. So, final bit, top tips. We need to consistently engage students. We might have a fantastic thing happening in first year. If the students don't touch it again, it's lost. So just one touch point a semester. And it has to be explicit. And tell the powers that be that by making it explicit, we're ahead of the game when performance-based metrics come in, as they will. We have to consistently engage staff and make it explicit. It's exactly the same exercise. So, work with staff, try and have that space in the T&L forum. If they're stressed about needing to publish, make the link with SOTL and educational research. We make a start. This room, you could find 20 things in a unit easily because you're in this space. Your average person, just one. And the 10-step process is cyclical, so we do it every semester. And if you're passing it on, you're going to be doubling the effort each time. Actually, it would be, my maths is hopeless, but yes, 2, 4, it will be that effect. Then we link individual initiatives, lots of ways to do that, but I think maybe that single visual program map is a really good way for us to start. Institutional definitions, they still are variously including things like skills and they're outcomes based. So if you're in the space where you can influence that, look at a definition that is more developmental. We need to share good practice. I know that in this room there's some amazing things that have happened. A few of you have mentioned it, Wayne, with the blogs. Tell me about it, please, because that good practice is what will really enable other people. And that includes in the co-curricular space. And finally, look for opportunities. The opportunities, we can all make something happen next week, the one thing. But opportunities for embedded and sustained change, that happens when there is a programme review, common core units. That's my idea of heaven. You have lots of students in the same place. Often the common core is foundation and they're saying, don't really know how this relates to me. And that's an opportunity to impact a lot of students very quickly. So lots of journal articles and papers on the website. There are the sites again, and thank you so much for all your ideas this morning. Thank you.